Much of contemporary Western society is wedded to an individualist mindset, assuming that human beings are rational, autonomous, and free to make choices as they please, so long as they satisfy their own desires while not infringing upon the capacity of others to do the same. From centuries of Christian ethics concerned with the craft of individual ethical responsibility, preparing one's soul for the afterlife, to a modernist tradition of political philosophers such as Thomas Hobbes and John Locke, who advocated for a view of human beings as autonomous actors contractually forming societies via rational choice, there are myriad reasons for this individualist norm to be the case. And yet, over the last century or so, individualism has come to be seen with an ever more wary gaze. Feminist philosophers in particular grew to see the individualist paradigm as inadequate to explain human behavior and the kinds of beings we humans are. Feminist philosophy brings the individual into critical relief, showing how the classical account of the individual as a free, autonomous, rational entity is insufficient to account for the kinds of beings we humans are. By recognizing humans as epistemological and existential interdependence and relativity, feminist philosophy allows us to comfortably reject the classical notion of individualism in exchange for a more contextualized, nuanced, and social understanding of human knowledge and action. First and foremost, feminism requires that knowledge, being, and behavior no longer be seen in a vacuum, unfazed by things like gender. Many feminists came to realize that hiding behind the seemingly innocent and trivially true framework of individualism was a whole array of assumptions about humans' relations to one another, our obligations, and the ways we come to know each other. In Elizabeth Anderson's Feminist Epistemology, she brings W.V. Quine's naturalized epistemology to bear against the tradition of epistemology which has assumed that the individual inquirer can be bracketed, so to speak, if they are inquiring rationally, dispassionately removing themselves from their social relations and assumptions. However, following Helen Longino, Anderson recognizes that rational inquiry is a social enterprise. Considering that we humans are always already social, acting from the moment we're born amidst a community of fellow inquirers and actors who depend upon one another, feminists like Anderson are extremely wary of the individualist's claim to be able to simply bracket those social factors. Contrary to the individualist, naturalized epistemologists consider knowledge production as an activity in which inquirers are subject to the same causal roles that affect their object of study, concerned with investigating how knowledge changes as we change factors concerning the inquirers. Naturalized epistemology breaks down the notion of epistemic objectivity, that we could, with the help of rationality, break out of our subjectivity and look upon things from a God's eye point of view, and forces us to consider factors about the inquirer of knowledge as much as, if not more than, the object of knowledge itself. Human beings become themselves another object to be investigated within a discourse, and as such, showing the irrevocably social nature of knowledge and thus human behavior at large, forcing an obstinate individualist approach to fragment and accept the radical contingency of knowledge. Building on these subject-relative concerns, Sandra Harding, in her Rethinking Standpoint Epistemology, shows how, in light of the social nature of knowledge claims and knowledge production, the contingency and preliminary nature of subjects of knowledge is forced to the fore in a way that makes us question not only the objects of our knowledge and how we might know them, but also who gets to count as a subject of knowledge and thus capable of saying things about the way things are. As a feminist, Harding recognizes that while the modernists of the Hobbesian Lockean variety may claim that all men are created equal, a statement which many today claim means and meant at the time that all people are created equal, this is in fact not how women have been or are treated. Marginality is part of what it is to be a woman, and along with this comes a whole host of legitimating concepts such as rationality, which have historically been denied to women. As such, feminists realize that the mark of marginality is both its material and psychological hindrance to the individual woman's life, but also women's unique standpoint in the social field to understand the techniques and tactics used by patriarchal society to enforce gender inequality. As such, standpoint theorists argue for starting off thought from the lives of marginalized peoples. Beginning in those determinate objective locations in any social order will generate illuminating critical questions that do not arise in thoughts that begin from dominant group lives. Bypassing the typically unreflective obstinacy of those situated in positions of privilege, standpoint epistemology forces us to further examine the importance of individual alterity in analyzing knowledge. By seeing subjects of knowledge as multiple, heterogeneous, and contradictory or incoherent, partially as a result of oppressive forces acting upon disenfranchised groups, feminist epistemology situates inquirers as varying elements in a vast network of social relations that forces one to see individualism as unhelpfully narrow and ignorant of the multiplicitous extra-individual factors necessary to constitute one as a subject. These critiques of individualism, however, do not just hold for epistemology. Indeed, perhaps more relevant for the everyday person is the feminist critique of individualism as an ethical position. Joan Tronto, in An Ethics of Care, shows how individualism takes for granted the means by which we each have our needs met. While the individualist maintains an ideal of self-sufficiency, care ethics questions the desirability of this as an ideal, as well as the accuracy of individualism in accounting for human behavior. Tronto, like other care ethicists, stresses the necessity for us to be cared for in society and to care for others as part of our assumed social duties. Tronto states that by its very nature, care is concerned with conditions of vulnerability and inequality. Contrary to the individualist framework, which tends to approach ethics from a rather idealistic, all things being equal approach, care ethics stresses the fundamental inequality of the relationships and corresponding duties we often have for one another. Explaining how we hold different ethical obligations to different kinds of people, Tronto stresses that this inequality of obligation is tied to a model of vulnerability, which sees our ethical obligations as stemming from a need and obligation to care for the vulnerable. Considering that we were at one time vulnerable to a significant degree, say as a newborn, and still are in many respects. Vulnerability, she says, belies the myth that we're always autonomous and potentially equal citizens. To assume equality among human beings leaves out and ignores important dimensions of human existence. A political order that presumes only independence and autonomy as the nature of human life thereby misses a great deal of human experience. By recognizing the fundamentally individual nature of human life, split between the desire to act freely and the recognition of our dependence upon others, this emphasis on vulnerability serves to undermine individualism as the solely or even primarily adequate framework for understanding human relations and actions. As such, a feminist ethics that rejects individualism is thereby more able to account for social aspects of human behavior that a cold, individualist account would not be able to. While some may object that rejecting individualism destroys any concept of selfhood necessary to function as a knower or ethical actor at all, I must specify my and my employed philosophers' relation to individualism. All of these thinkers would no doubt accept that they're each people, that they act and think and can thereby be seen as concrete entities, replete with unique traits. My and their point is not that one simply rejects the concept of the individual whole cloth, but rather that it must be critically examined against a social, contingent, and multiplicitous background that forces us to see individuals as component members of a larger tapestry, rather than the sole or even primary arbiter of pure knowledge or moral obligations. While this objection is right to worry about the individual being so dwarfed that he or she becomes negligent, this is merely a reflection of the need for feminist frameworks sensitive enough to account for cultural and individual differences, than it is a refutation of feminism as such. Further work is necessary to delineate the precise ways by which knowledge is formed, produced, and disseminated, as well as actions justified and enabled. Regardless, however, this objection does not invalidate any of the aforementioned thinkers' ideas. In fact, Harding recognizes that there are in fact many different yet concrete subjects/objects of knowledge. Her point is merely that we cannot accept the epistemic inquirer as a pre-existent, coherent, and transparently obvious category in advance, but must instead reconcile many different inquirers in an epistemic framework which is at once critical and accommodating. As such, feminist philosophy has many reasons to be suspicious of individualism, and many ways in which its theorists respond to and elaborate systems of socially contingent, inquirer-sensitive frameworks for analyzing knowledge and action. By recontextualizing individualism in the manner of standpoint epistemology, tracking its inability to account for a significant amount of human behavior, my goal here is to undermine those who would insist that objectivity, truth, duty, etc. can be reached or even conceived of divorced from social analysis of the inquirers and the forces acting upon them. By tracing the preliminary steps of recent feminist epistemology and ethics, it should hopefully be clear that an obstinately individualist approach presumes a number of dubious and counterproductive ideals that interfere with philosophical analyses of knowledge and action, and risk perpetuating oppressive concepts more than they already have been.